Hi guys, my name is Kieran and today I'm going to be discussing with you the theory of behaviorism, and I'm going to kind of start with the general overview and then we'll jump right into the specifics of it. So in the late 1800s and the early 1900s you've got Freud's psychoanalytic theory, and of course it's all about the thought processes, the inner workings of the mind, states of consciousness, and these are things that you cannot see with the naked eye. So you can't really study them scientifically, and he kind of had to make assumptions about certain things because again you can't see it to study it. So this kind of made some scientists a little irritated, one of them being John Watson. He's known as the founder of behaviorism because he first coined the term, and in 1913 he wrote the Behaviorist Manifesto, and this was just kind of a call to arms to stray away from the study of things that you could not observe, like thoughts and states of consciousness, to things that you could observe, like behaviors. So he believed that psychology is the science of behavior, so only observable behavioral data should be used. Thoughts and states of consciousness are not proper objects for study because again you can't see them. And his goal for psychology was to predict and control overt behavior. And he also came up with this theory, this law of frequency, and this just states that the more frequent stimulus and response association equals a stronger habit. So the more you associate a response and a stimulus, the stronger that behavior is going to become. And behaviorism also had its roots in the logical positivism movement, and this just simply stated that the meaning of scientific statements should only be expressed in terms of experimental conditions or observations that verify their truth. So again, only things that could be observed should be studied. So now we're going to talk about the basic principles. The theory of behaviorism kind of makes three claims, and the first one, like I just mentioned, was that psychology is a science of behavior, so it's all about behavior, nothing to do with the inner mind or its workings. And the second one was that behavior can be described and explained without any reference to mental events or internal psychological processes. So behavior comes from the environment, it is external and it is not internal, it does not come from the head or the mind. And lastly, the third claim is that if somehow behavior is explained in terms of mental terms or concepts, then behaviorists believe that these concepts should just be eliminated or replaced by behavioral terms, or they should just be translated or paraphrased into behavioral concepts. So again, they're trying to get rid of any mention of the inner mind and its workings. In behaviorism, the smallest unit of study is the associations between a stimulus and a response, and behaviorists usually call this the SR associations. And they define learning as the acquisition of new behaviors due to practice. So practice is how you acquire and learn a new behavior, nothing to do with genes or psychological processes or thought processes. It's all about practice. So now we're going to talk about the two kinds of learning that the behaviorism theory talks about. And the first one is Pavlov's classical conditioning. And of course, we all know his famous study with the dogs. So you start with an unconditioned stimulus, which in the case of the dogs was the food. And that elicits an unconditioned response, which is salivation. So you just show a dog a bowl of food and they'll salivate. But then you take a neutral stimulus, which in this case was the bell, and you pair it with the unconditioned stimulus, and that elicits the unconditioned response. So after enough association, you get the neutral stimulus turns into the conditioned stimulus, and the unconditioned response turns into the conditioned response. So after conditioning, all Pavlov had to do was ring the bell and the dog salivated because they learned to associate the sound of the bell with food, and then food makes them salivate. And he also posited 4 stages of classical conditioning. The first one is acquisition, and this is just initial learning of the conditioned response. You also have extinction, which is the disappearance of the conditioned response. Then you have generalization, and this is when the conditioned response might occur with stimuli similar to the neutral stimulus that was turned into the conditioned stimulus. And then you also have discrimination, in which the conditioned response might occur with one stimuli but not another. And to give you kind of another example, you can think of the little Albert experiment. And this is where Watson took little Albert, he was a toddler, and they showed him this white fuzzy rat. And at first he wasn't scared of it, he pet it, he played with it. But then they presented it again, and this time, at the same time, they made a loud noise behind him, and of course that scared him and made him jump. So they kept pairing this white rat, the sight of the white rat, with the loud sound. And so Albert was conditioned to elicit a response of fear simply by seeing this rat. And he also generalized his fear to some other small furry objects. So he was scared at the sight of a rabbit, at the sight of a Santa Claus mask because it had the white beard on it. So this study can also shows us that phobias and fears can be conditioned, and in return they can also be become extinct because you can condition yourself to kind of get rid of that fear. So next we have Edward Thorndike's law of effect, and he had puzzle boxes, and in these puzzle boxes he would put cats, and just outside of their reach he would have a bowl of food. So the cat would learn to press the lever inside the box, which then opened up the door of the box, and the cat was allowed to go out and get the food. So he learned to do this repeated number of times to keep getting the food, the reward. So his law of effect just states that responses with the satisfying effect become more frequent, and responses with the discomforting effect become less frequent. So responses are used to produce pleasure and avoid pain through a process similar to natural selection. And his law of effect kind of snowballed into B.F. Skinner's operant conditioning, and this is all about reinforcement. So you reinforce a behavior through rewards, or you can stop it by punishment. So reinforcement is a strengthening of a behavior. You can have positive and negative reinforcement, and not positive and negative in this situation doesn't mean positive as in give them candy, or negative, spank them. It just means positive, adding a stimulus, negative, taking it away. So with positive reinforcement, you add a rewarding stimulus. You reward your kid with a candy bar every time they come home with a new grade, so they're encouraged to keep getting good grades. You have negative reinforcement where you take away an unpleasant stimulus, so removing that kind of uncomfortable situation encourages them to keep doing the behavior. Then you have punishment, which is getting rid of a behavior or discouraging it. And again, you have positive and negative aspects of this. Positive punishment, you add an unpleasant stimulus. So you might, spank your child because they did something bad. So it discourages them from doing that again. You have negative punishment, which is the removal of a rewarding stimulus. So if you want your child to keep getting good grades, or if you want your child to stop getting bad grades and you want to stop getting bad grades and encourage them to get good grades, you may take away their Xbox so that they can focus more on their grades. Skinner had his Skinner boxes, and he would put rats in the boxes and have them press a lever and get a reward of food. And this is his study on the schedules of reinforcement. So he wanted to see which schedule had the slowest extinction rate. And in this case, extinction rate means just stopping the behavior, getting rid of it. So he had continuous reinforcement, and that's just every time the rat pressed the lever, he got a pellet of food. And this had the fastest extinction rate because in real life, you're not going to get a reward every single time you do a behavior. So they simply got bored of it and just learned to not do it. They just didn't do it anymore because it was kind of boring. In real life, they realized that in real life, they're not going to get a reward every single time. Then you have partial reinforcement, and this is when the reward is given only part of the time that the behavior is produced. So you have 4 types of partial reinforcement. The first one is fixed ratio, and this is when rewards are given after a set number of times. So the rat may get a food pellet every 5 times he presses the lever. Then you have variable ratio, in which it's given after a random number of times. So he may need to press the lever 3 times to get the reward, and then the next time press it 5 times in order to get the reward. So there's a lot of unpredictability there. Then you have variable ratio, and this is when rewards are given after a fixed amount of time. So he may need to press it for 30 seconds before he gets the reward. So every 30 seconds he gets this pellet of food. And then you have variable interval, and the rewards are given after a random amount of time. So the first time he has to wait 30 seconds to get the food, the next time he has to wait a minute, then the next time he has to wait 45 seconds, So again, it's unpredictable. He never knows when he's going to get the next pellet of food. And he found that the schedule of reinforcement with the slowest extinction rate was the variable ratio schedule. And this is because it's all about that unpredictability. So just like in casinos, you never know when you're gonna, hit the jackpot. It could be after 3 spins, it could be after 6 spins, after 10 spins, you never know. So that unpredictability is what encourages gamblers to keep going, keep gambling, because, hey, it could be you hit the jackpot on your next turn, and then, oh, you don't hit it. Oh, maybe next time, it's the unpredictability of it. And lastly, with Skinner, he had this concept of shaping, and this is just simply changing the form of a behavior. So you can start with a small behavior, and through continuous reinforcement, you can get them to change their behavior into a more desirable one, or a more complex behavior. So now that we talked about the basic principles, we're going to talk about the criticisms of behaviorism. The most obvious one is that behavior does not entirely depend on reinforcement or conditioning. There are inner workings of the mind, as much as they didn't want to believe it. There are inner workings of the mind and processes that do contribute to learning and the learning of behavior. So it also ignores the cognitive aspect of learning. When they were doing these experiments with children, they figured out that they were using cognitive processes to speed up the process of learning. So they weren't only using rewards to encourage behavior, they were also kind of figuring out, oh, hey, if I do this, then it, results in this. So they were using their thought processes. And there also are some biological predispositions to learning. So your genes may result in you learning a skill faster than someone else. So there are some genetic aspects to learning. And lastly, a scientist, Chomsky, he kind of made a big blow to Skinner in specific, because he stated that behaviorism could not explain the acquisition of a skill as complex as language. We all know how hard it is to learn language, but there has to be some type of thought processes or process in the mind that aids in something as complex as learning language, because you simply can't be rewarded in learning behavior. There has to be something else behind it. So that was kind of the biggest blow to the theory of behaviorism, was that, how do you explain complex skills and learning complex skills in terms of just rewards and punishment. So now we're going to talk about the value of that behaviorism brings to developmental psychology. So although it did not mention anything about the nature of learning, it did talk about the nurture of learning. So it definitely demonstrates the environment's effect on learning and behavior. It also provided a scientific aspect to psychology and observable behavior, rather than the kind of assumptions and speculations that Freud had to make concerning states of consciousness and the inner workings of the mind that could not be directly observed. So it did provide a scientific aspect to psychology. And it led to the social learning theory and the research on observational and abstract modeling. So it kind of took behaviorism a step further by saying, hey, you can also learn something by simply observing someone and then modeling what they have done. And then lastly, it generated behavior therapy and the behavior management techniques. So now in today's world, we have cognitive behavioral psychology, therapy, and so it's kind of goes back to little Albert's study. You can get rid of a fear, or you can learn to fear something through behaviorism and this operant conditioning and classical conditioning. So today in behavior therapy, they kind of use that to change behaviors. So like if you want to stop biting your nails, you may use therapy and the concept of behaviorism to get you to stop that behavior or change it into a more desirable behavior. So that concludes my presentation on behaviorism. I did include a few pictures in the study guide if you wanted to look at those, if you do better by looking at visuals to understand something. I know that in the textbook itself there wasn't a chapter on behaviorism. The only thing that they talked about was kind of a little introduction to social learning theory. So I hope that this presentation kind of aided in your understanding of that small part of the book that they talked about. And I hope it went into more depth so that you can understand it better. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them. I love this type. This is like my favorite type of developmental learning. So thank you guys so much for tuning in and listening, and thank you so much.